To cook rice where every grain comes out separate, light, and not sticky, there is a simple method that has to be followed. But if you look at how most Britons cook rice, that is rarely the result they get. Instead, it often turns out sticky and uneven, soft on the outside but not properly cooked through, and over time this has simply become normal. In the next few minutes, I'll walk you through some of the biggest mistakes most homes make when cooking rice and explain the proper way to do it so your rice turns out separate and fully cooked every time. Once it's done right, the difference is clear. It becomes lighter, not sticky, and far more enjoyable to eat. Let's start with a common mistake: guessing the water instead of measuring it properly. This is where most of the problem starts. When cooking rice, the amount of water you use is not something that should be guessed, yet in most British kitchens, it often is. People use a mug, a cup, or whatever is available, which is perfectly fine. The issue is not the container being used, but the lack of consistency in how the measurement is done. From a proper cooking standpoint, the ratio between rice and water is what determines how the rice will turn out. For standard white rice, the method is simple. 1 cup or 1 mug of rice should be matched with 2 cups or 2 mugs of water. The important part is using the same cup for both so that the ratio remains accurate. What usually happens instead is that water is added by eye. A little more if it looks dry, or slightly less if it seems like too much. That small adjustment is enough to change the result completely. When too much water is used, and the grains begin to soften too quickly, the outer layer breaks down, releasing starch into the pot, and the rice starts to clump together. On the other hand, when there is not enough water, the outside of the grain may soften, but the inside remains firm, leaving the rice partly cooked. This is why the result feels inconsistent from one attempt to the next. Once the water is measured properly, everything starts to settle into place. The rice absorbs exactly what it needs, the grains stay intact, and the texture becomes lighter and more even. And once this part is done correctly, the next step becomes just as important. Because even with the right measurement, another common mistake can still affect how the rice turns out. Not rinsing the rice before cooking. When rice is taken straight from the bag and put into the pot without rinsing, it still carries a layer of loose surface starch. This starch is what directly affects how the rice behaves as it cooks. As heat is applied, that starch begins to dissolve into the water. Instead of the grains cooking separately, they start to bind together. That is what creates the sticky, clumped texture many people are used to. It is not just about how the rice looks. It changes how it feels when you eat it, making it heavier and less defined. This is why rinsing matters. Running the rice under cold water helps remove that excess starch before cooking begins. As you rinse, the water will appear cloudy at first. That cloudiness is the starch being washed away. Once the water starts to run clear, most of that surface starch has been removed, and the rice is ready to cook properly. Without that step, you are effectively cooking the rice in its own starch, which encourages the grains to stick together rather than remain separate. Another habit that often comes into play here is parboiling. Some people try to correct sticky rice by boiling it in excess water first and then draining it, similar to how pasta is cooked. While this can reduce some of the starch, it introduces a different problem. The rice begins to lose control over how it absorbs water. Some grains become too soft, others remain slightly firm, and the overall texture becomes inconsistent. Properly rinsed rice does not need to be parboiled. When the excess starch is removed at the beginning and the water is measured correctly, the rice is able to absorb the right amount of moisture on its own, and without needing to be drained halfway through. Once the starch has been dealt with, the next factor that affects how evenly the rice cooks is the cookware itself, because the type of pan you use determines how heat is distributed from start to finish. Using the wrong type of pan. Once the rice and water are measured properly and the excess starch has been removed, the next thing that begins to affect the outcome is the pan you are using. This is something many people do not pay attention to, but it plays a major role in how evenly the rice cooks. In most kitchens, rice is cooked in whatever pot is available. Thin pots, lightweight pans, or ones that heat up too quickly are often used without much thought. The problem with this is how they handle heat. A thin pan does not distribute heat evenly. Some parts of the pot become hotter than others, especially at the base. As the rice begins to cook, the grains at the bottom are exposed to more direct heat, causing them to cook faster, soften too quickly, or even start sticking to the base of the pan. At the same time, the grains above are not receiving that same level of heat, which slows down their cooking. This creates a mismatch in texture, where some parts of the rice are overcooked while others are not fully done. The result is uneven rice, even if the water and preparation were done correctly. A heavier, thick-bottom pan handles this differently. It spreads heat more evenly across the base and allows the rice to cook at a steady rate rather than in patches. This consistency is what helps each grain cook at the same pace. The lid also plays a part here. A pan that comes with a proper, tight-fitting lid helps keep the steam inside, which is essential for the rice to absorb the water evenly. If the lid is loose or does not seal properly, steam escapes, and that interrupts the cooking process. So even with the right measurements and properly rinsed rice, using the wrong pan can still affect the final result. The next mistake tends to happen during the cooking itself, especially when the heat is not adjusted at the right time. Cooking on high heat all the way through. Many people leave the heat high from the moment the pot goes on the stove until the rice is finished. The thinking behind it is simple. A stronger boil feels like it will cook the rice faster and more thoroughly, so the heat is left untouched. At the beginning, this seems to work. The water comes up to a boil quickly, the pot looks active, and it feels like progress is being made. The issue starts immediately after that point, when the role of heat is supposed to change. Once the water reaches a boil, the objective is no longer to force rapid bubbling. The rice has already been exposed to enough heat to begin softening. What it needs next is time and controlled conditions to absorb the water gradually. Keeping the heat high at this stage works against that process. Instead of allowing the rice to take in the water steadily, the heat drives the moisture out of the pot too quickly. A large portion of the water escapes as steam before the grains have had enough time to absorb it. From the outside, it may look like the water has reduced as expected, but inside the grains, the absorption is incomplete. This is where the imbalance begins. Now, the rice sitting at the bottom of the pot is exposed to stronger, more direct heat. Those grains begin to soften rapidly and can even start breaking down. At the same time, the grains above are left with less available moisture and less time to cook properly. So while one part is over-softening, another part is still catching up. That contrast is what creates rice that feels uneven. You may notice some portions turning soft and slightly sticky, while others still carry a firmer bite. Another effect of high heat is how it agitates the pot. Constant bubbling moves the grains around more than necessary, increasing friction between them. This encourages more starch to be released, which adds to the problem of clumping. Reducing the heat after the initial boil changes the entire behavior of the rice. A lower, steady heat allows the water to remain in the pot long enough to be absorbed fully. Instead of escaping quickly, the moisture is taken in gradually by each grain. The cooking becomes quieter and more controlled, and the rice begins to cook from the inside out rather than collapsing too quickly on the surface. With this approach, the grains have enough time to soften evenly, hold their shape, and separate naturally. It may seem like a small adjustment, but it is one of the key differences between rice that is simply boiled and rice that is properly cooked. If this is already helping you see where things may have been going wrong, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. It helps more people find this, and it means you won't miss the next breakdown. There is another habit that often happens during cooking, and although it feels helpful, it ends up interfering with this same balance in a different way. Stirring the rice while it's cooking. During cooking, many people feel the need to keep the rice moving. It is often done out of habit with the idea that stirring will help it cook more evenly or stop it from sticking. On the surface, that seems reasonable, but in reality, it works against the process. As the rice heats up and begins absorbing water, the grains gradually soften. At this stage, they are no longer firm and become more delicate. Any unnecessary movement starts to affect their structure. When the rice is stirred repeatedly, the grains rub against each other and begin to break slightly, releasing additional starch into the pot, even if the rice was rinsed properly at the start. That released starch thickens the water around the rice and creates the conditions for the grains to stick together. Instead of staying separate, they begin to bind, forming that heavy, clumped texture that many people are trying to avoid. There is also the issue of stability during cooking. Rice relies on a steady balance of heat and trapped moisture to cook evenly. Stirring interrupts that balance, shifting the grains around before they have had time to absorb water properly, which leads to uneven results. A more controlled approach is much simpler. After bringing the rice up to the boil, a single light stir is enough to level it out. From that point, the heat is reduced, the lid is placed on, and the rice is left undisturbed. That stillness allows the grains to cook evenly, absorb moisture at the same rate, and hold their shape. And another habit often follows this one closely, and it affects the same balance of heat and moisture in a different way. Lifting the lid too often while it's cooking. A common habit during cooking is checking the rice repeatedly by lifting the lid. It is usually done to see if the water has dried up or if the rice feels ready, but this small action has a direct impact on how the rice cooks. Rice does not cook only from the heat at the base of the pot. A large part of the process comes from the steam that builds up inside once the lid is on. That steam circulates through the grains and helps them absorb moisture evenly. Each time the lid is lifted, that trapped steam escapes. The temperature inside the pot drops slightly and the cooking environment is disturbed. This forces the rice to readjust each time, slowing down the process and making it less consistent. Over time, this repeated interruption leads to uneven cooking. Some parts of the rice may lose moisture too quickly, while others are still trying to absorb what is left. The result is rice that does not cook uniformly, even if everything else was done correctly. Keeping the lid closed allows the heat and steam to remain stable. The rice is then able to absorb water gradually without interruption, which helps the grains cook through at the same rate. It may feel like something needs to be checked, but in this case, leaving it alone produces a better result than constant monitoring. There is another step that affects this same process, and it comes down to how the pot is covered during cooking. Another point that often gets overlooked is how the pot is covered during cooking. Many people place a lid on top without checking if it fits properly, while others leave small gaps or partially cover the pot, thinking it will not make much difference. In reality, this step plays a major role in how the rice cooks. Rice relies on trapped steam to cook evenly. After the water reaches a boil and the heat is reduced, the remaining moisture is meant to stay inside the pot and circulate through the grains. That steam is what allows the rice to absorb water fully and cook through without drying out. When the lid is loose or not sealed properly, steam begins to escape. As that moisture leaves the pot, the balance inside changes. The rice is left with less water than it needs to finish cooking properly. This often leads to rice that looks done on the surface but is not fully cooked inside. In some cases, and the bottom layer may begin to dry out or stick while the upper layer remains slightly undercooked. Even small gaps can affect the process. A lid that fits tightly keeps the environment stable, allowing the rice to cook at a steady pace from start to finish. Getting this part right does not require anything complicated. It simply means using a pot with a lid that closes properly and leaving it in place once the cooking begins. With the heat controlled and the steam properly contained, the rice is able to cook evenly without interruption. The final mistake is one that happens after the cooking is complete, yet it has a strong effect on the texture of the rice when it is served. Serving the rice immediately without letting it rest. As soon as the heat is turned off, many people go straight in to serve the rice. It looks ready at that point, the water has disappeared, and from the outside it seems like the cooking is complete. What is not visible is what is still happening inside the pot. Even after the heat is switched off, the rice continues to cook using the heat that has already built up. There is still trapped steam and moisture moving through the grains, and this final stage is what allows everything to settle properly. At this point, the moisture inside the rice is not evenly distributed. Some grains have absorbed slightly more water than others, and some parts of the pot may still be finishing the cooking process. If the rice is disturbed or served immediately, that balance is interrupted. This is why freshly cooked rice can feel inconsistent. You may notice that some portions are softer while others feel slightly firmer, even though the rice appeared done when the heat was turned off. Allowing the rice to rest for a few minutes changes that completely. During this short resting period, the remaining heat continues to move gently through the rice and the moisture spreads more evenly across all the grains. Instead of certain areas holding excess water while others lack it, everything begins to level out. At the same time, the grains firm up slightly as they settle. This is important because it helps them hold their structure. When you go in too early, the grains are still delicate and can easily break or stick together. After resting, they separate more naturally and maintain their shape. This is also the stage where the texture becomes lighter. When the rice has had time to settle, it no longer feels heavy or clumped. Each grain stands more independently, and when it is fluffed gently with a fork or spoon, it lifts and separates instead of compressing together. Skipping this step removes that final stage of control. It leaves the rice in a half-set state, where the structure has not fully stabilized and the texture has not properly developed. Giving it just 5 minutes to rest allows everything to come together. It completes the process that started from measuring the water, rinsing the rice, controlling the heat, and leaving it undisturbed. Without this final step, the result will always fall slightly short of what properly cooked rice should be. Cooking rice properly is not about doing anything complicated. It comes down to avoiding a few common mistakes and following a simple, consistent method from start to finish. Once the water is measured correctly, the excess starch is rinsed away, the heat is controlled, and the rice is left to cook without interference, the results begin to change. The grains become separate, the texture becomes lighter, and the outcome is no longer unpredictable. These are small adjustments, but together they make a clear difference in how the rice turns out. If this helped you see where things may have been going wrong, share your experience in the comments. It would be useful to know which of these mistakes you have noticed before or which one made the biggest difference for you. And if you want more simple breakdowns like this, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel so you do not miss the next one.